Picture this. You're walking through the bustling streets of ancient Babylon in 1750 BCE. The air thick with incense and the sound of temple bells echoing across the ziggurat's massive steps. Merchants hawk their wares while priests in elaborate robes glide silently through the crowds, their eyes holding secrets that would make your blood run cold. Because behind those towering walls, beneath those golden statues of gods with names like Marduk and Ishtar, rituals are taking place that represent some of the most disturbing acts of religious devotion in human history. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of ancient excess. This is the story of how sacred duty became systematic exploitation, how religious fervor transformed into institutionalized horror, and how entire civilizations built their spiritual foundations on the suffering of the most vulnerable. The rituals I'm about to describe weren't hidden aberrations. They were celebrated ceremonies, sanctified by law, and blessed by the highest authorities in the land. Before diving into these forgotten practices that history tried to bury, if you enjoy uncovering the dark truths behind ancient civilizations, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it fascinating that we're exploring these ancient mysteries together from different corners of the world, connected across millennia by our shared curiosity about humanity's darkest chapters. The civilization we know as Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, gave birth to writing, mathematics, and the first cities. But it also created religious practices so disturbing that even ancient historians struggled to document them without horror. These weren't primitive barbarisms committed by ignorant savages. They were sophisticated ceremonies performed by the most educated, wealthy, and powerful people in the ancient world, people who saw themselves as the pinnacle of civilization. Let's start with the place where it all began, the temples themselves. These weren't just places of worship. They were economic powerhouses that controlled vast territories, commanded armies of slaves, and wielded influence that rivaled kings. The ziggurat of Babylon rose nearly 300 feet into the sky, its steps carved with intricate reliefs depicting gods and mortals locked in eternal struggle. But these magnificent structures concealed chambers where acts were performed that would be considered unconscionable by any modern standard. The priesthood that controlled these temples operated under a religious system that viewed certain forms of suffering as sacred offerings to the gods. They believed that divine favor could only be earned through extreme acts of devotion, acts that often required the complete submission of human bodies and spirits to religious authority. This wasn't metaphorical submission. It was literal, physical, and devastating in ways that defy comprehension. At the heart of these practices lay the concept of sacred prostitution, though that sanitized term barely captures the reality of what occurred within temple walls. The Mesopotamians believed that sexual union with temple servants was a form of communion with the divine, a way for mortals to participate in the creative forces that governed the universe. But this wasn't voluntary spiritual expression between consenting adults. It was a system that consumed thousands of young lives in service to religious dogma that treated human beings as expendable offerings to hungry gods. The selection process began early, targeting children who possessed the physical beauty that priests claimed the gods demanded. Families throughout Mesopotamia faced impossible choices when temple officials arrived in their villages. Some children were given willingly by parents who believed they were securing divine favor for their households. Others were taken as tribute, payment for debts, taxes, or simply because the temple's appetite for fresh victims was insatiable. These weren't random selections based on cruel whim. The priests had developed elaborate criteria for choosing their victims, examining bone structure, skin quality, and even testing children's voices to ensure they met divine specifications. They looked for specific combinations of youth and beauty, that they claimed reflected the perfection of the gods themselves. The selection process could take days, with children lined up like livestock, while robed figures evaluated their potential for sacred service. Once selected, children as young as 7 or 8 were removed from their families and brought to the temple complex, where they began a transformation process designed to strip away their individual, remake them as identities and living vessels for divine will. They were given new names, usually variations on the names of gods, and forbidden to speak of their former lives or families. Any attempt to maintain connection to their past was punished with brutal efficiency. The training process was elaborate and psychologically devastating. Children were taught to see their bodies as sacred property belonging to the gods, not as personal possessions over which they had any control. They learned elaborate rituals of purification, memorized complex prayers in languages they didn't understand, and practiced forms of submission that prepared them for their eventual role as temple servants. But perhaps most disturbing was how the system convinced its victims that their suffering was not only necessary but holy. The priests developed sophisticated theological justifications for every cruelty, every violation, every moment of degradation. They taught the children that pain was purification, that submission was salvation, that their sacrifice would earn them eternal reward in the afterlife. The victims learned to police themselves, to feel guilt and shame when they experienced natural human emotions like fear, anger, or the desire for freedom. The temple quarters where these children lived were designed to reinforce their isolation and dependence. Beautiful on the surface, decorated with precious metals and exotic fabrics, but functionally prisons that made escape impossible. The children slept in communal chambers where privacy was non-existent and personal possessions were forbidden. Every aspect of their daily lives was controlled by temple authorities who claimed to speak with divine authority. As these children matured, they faced increasingly sophisticated forms of exploitation disguised as religious ceremony. The rituals themselves were elaborate affairs, designed to convince both participants and observers that what was occurring was sacred rather than criminal. Wealthy merchants, government officials, and foreign dignitaries would come to the temples seeking divine favor through union with these consecrated servants, paying enormous sums that enriched the priestly class while destroying young lives. The economic incentives that drove this system were staggering. A single temple could generate wealth equivalent to modern millions through these practices, creating powerful interests invested in maintaining the supply of victims. The priests didn't just tolerate this exploitation, they refined it, systematized it, and exported it to temples throughout the region. What began as localized practices spread across the entire Mesopotamian world, creating a network of institutionalized abuse that persisted for centuries. Ancient records suggest that the most beautiful and compliant temple servants could expect to survive perhaps 5 to 10 years in active service before age, disease, or psychological breakdown made them unsuitable for their duties. Those who survived this initial period faced an uncertain future. Some were retained as trainers for new victims. Others were sold to private households as concubines, and many simply disappeared from the historical record entirely. The psychological damage inflicted by this system extended far beyond the immediate victims. Entire families were traumatized by the loss of their children to temple service. Communities lived in constant fear that their sons and daughters might be selected for sacred duty. The ripple effects of this institutionalized cruelty touched every level of Mesopotamian society, creating a culture where the suffering of the vulnerable was not just accepted, but celebrated as evidence of divine favor. What makes these practices particularly disturbing is how they were integrated into the broader fabric of civilized life. The same temples that consumed children in religious rituals also served as centers of learning, preserving the mathematical and astronomical knowledge that forms the foundation of modern science. The priests who orchestrated systematic abuse were often the most educated people in their society, capable of complex calculations and sophisticated theological reasoning. They created beautiful art, wrote moving poetry, and made genuine contributions to human knowledge, all while perpetrating horrors that beggar description. This wasn't hypocrisy in the modern sense. It was a completely different moral framework that placed religious duty above individual human worth. The Mesopotamians had developed elaborate justifications for practices that we would recognize as crimes against humanity, viewing them instead as necessary sacrifices that maintained cosmic order and ensured divine protection for their civilization. The scale of this system is almost impossible to comprehend from our modern perspective. Archaeological evidence suggests that major temples maintained hundreds of these consecrated servants at any given time, with constant turnover requiring a steady supply of new victims. Across the entire Mesopotamian world, thousands of children were being consumed by this religious machinery every year. Their lives offered up to gods whose hunger seemed infinite and whose mercy was entirely absent. The foreign visitors who witnessed these ceremonies often left detailed accounts that reveal just how normalized this systematic cruelty had become. A Hittite diplomat, writing around 1400 BCE, described attending a festival at the Temple of Ishtar, where the evening's entertainment included what he euphemistically called divine unions between temple servants and wealthy patrons. He noted the elaborate preparations, the perfumed oils, the golden jewelry adorning young bodies, the incense that couldn't quite mask the smell of fear. What struck him most wasn't the acts themselves, which he seemed to accept as foreign custom, but the complete absence of joy or celebration among the victims. They moved through their assigned roles with the mechanical precision of trained performers, their eyes empty of everything except carefully controlled terror. These diplomatic records provide glimpses into the international nature of this exploitation. Mesopotamian temples didn't just serve local populations. They attracted pilgrims and wealthy visitors from across the known world. Egyptian merchants, Assyrian nobles, and Persian officials all participated in rituals that they understood to be both spiritually significant and physically gratifying. The temples marketed themselves as destinations where divine favor could be purchased through acts that combined religious devotion with carnal satisfaction. The economic calculations behind this system reveal its true nature with horrifying clarity. Temple accounting records, written in cuneiform on clay tablets, document the revenue generated by different categories of servants. Young children commanded the highest prices, with rates decreasing as victims aged or showed signs of physical or psychological damage. The most beautiful could generate income equivalent to a skilled craftsman's lifetime earnings in a single year. These weren't spiritual calculations. They were brutal assessments of human worth measured in silver and gold. The training process for new temple servants was designed to break down natural human resistance while building the specific skills that would maximize their economic value. Children learned to suppress all visible signs of distress, to respond to commands with immediate obedience, and to perform acts that violated every natural instinct while maintaining the appearance of willing participation. Those who couldn't master this psychological dissociation were typically transferred to less profitable but equally devastating roles within the temple hierarchy. The punishment systems used to maintain control were as sophisticated as they were cruel. Physical violence was common but carefully calibrated, enough to ensure compliance without damaging the merchandise. More insidious were the psychological techniques designed to convince victims that resistance was not just futile, but sinful. Children who showed signs of rebellion were subjected to ritual purification ceremonies that combined religious symbolism with systematic humiliation, reinforcing the lesson that their bodies belonged to the gods rather than themselves. The temple archives contain detailed records of these purification rituals, described in language that transforms torture into theology. Victims who had displeased their handlers were subjected to elaborate ceremonies involving ice-cold water heated metal implements, and hours of forced prayer in uncomfortable positions. These weren't punishments in the conventional sense. They were presented as opportunities for spiritual cleansing that would restore the victims' sacred purity and make them more pleasing to divine powers. Perhaps most disturbing were the graduation ceremonies that marked a child's transition from training to active service. These elaborate rituals, often lasting several days, were designed to destroy the last vestiges of personal identity while celebrating the victim's new role as a vessel for divine will. The ceremonies included elements that combined religious symbolism with sexual initiation, creating traumatic experiences that served both to break the child's spirit and to demonstrate their new status to the broader temple community. The participants in these graduation ceremonies weren't just temple priests, but included wealthy patrons who bid for the privilege of participating in what they understood to be sacred acts. The highest bidders earned the right to be part of rituals that combined religious significance with personal gratification, paying enormous sums for experiences that left permanent psychological scars on their victims while enriching the temple coffers. The long-term effects on survivors reveal the true scope of this systematic destruction. Those who lived through years of temple service often displayed what we would now recognize as severe trauma responses: inability to form normal relationships, persistent nightmares, and a kind of emotional numbness that made it difficult for them to experience joy or genuine human connection. Many became unable to distinguish between genuine affection and exploitation, having been conditioned to understand all physical contact through the lens of religious duty or economic transaction. The broader social implications were equally devastating. Families throughout Mesopotamian society lived with the constant fear that their children might be selected for temple service, creating a culture of anxiety and helplessness that pervaded daily life. Parents developed elaborate strategies to hide their most attractive children or to make them appear less desirable to temple scouts, but these efforts often proved futile against a system designed to identify and claim the victims it required. The religious justifications for these practices reveal how completely the priestly class had corrupted spiritual concepts to serve their exploitation. They taught that the gods required beauty and youth as offerings, that sexual contact with temple servants was a form of prayer, and that the suffering of the victims was actually a blessing that purified their souls and guaranteed them eternal reward. These weren't cynical lies told to manipulate the gullible. Many priests genuinely believed these theological constructions, having been raised in a system where such ideas were fundamental religious truths. The international spread of these practices demonstrates how successful this theological framework proved to be. Mesopotamian religious concepts influenced cultures across the ancient world, and with them traveled the institutions and practices that had grown up around sacred prostitution. Archaeological evidence suggests that similar systems operated in temples from Anatolia to the Indus Valley, creating a network of exploitation that spanned continents and persisted for millennia. The resistance that did emerge was quickly and brutally suppressed. Occasional records mention families who attempted to rescue their children from temple service, but these efforts were treated as crimes against the gods themselves, punishable by death or enslavement. The few victims who attempted escape faced not just physical recapture, but social condemnation from communities that had been taught to view temple service as the highest honor a family could receive. The most chilling aspect of this resistance suppression was how it was framed as spiritual warfare. Temple authorities didn't simply punish escape attempts. They transformed them into elaborate public ceremonies designed to demonstrate the futility of opposing divine will. Captured runaways were subjected to ritual degradation that served both as punishment and as terrifying examples to other potential resistors. These ceremonies drew crowds of thousands, turning human suffering into public entertainment, while reinforcing the theological message that defying the gods brought inevitable destruction. The documentation of these public punishments reveals the sophisticated psychological manipulation employed by the temple hierarchy. They presented the suffering of recaptured victims not as cruelty, but as divine justice, claiming that the gods themselves were expressing displeasure through the visible agony of those who had attempted to escape their sacred duties. Witnesses were encouraged to view the torture as proof of divine power rather than evidence of human brutality, creating a feedback loop that strengthened the system's hold on public consciousness. Even more disturbing were the ceremonies designed to celebrate successful compliance. Temples held elaborate festivals showcasing their most obedient servants, presenting victims who had completely surrendered their individual will as examples of perfect spiritual devotion. These celebrations attracted visitors from across the known world, generating enormous revenue while normalizing the complete destruction of human agency in service to religious authority. The economic records from these festivals reveal the true scale of the system's reach. A single celebration could generate wealth equivalent to funding entire military campaigns, with the profits distributed among temple officials, government authorities, and wealthy patrons who had invested in the institution. This created powerful incentives for maintaining and expanding the supply of victims, turning human trafficking into a cornerstone of the ancient economy. The training manuals preserved in temple archives provide horrifying insights into the systematic methods used to break down human resistance. These weren't crude techniques developed through trial and error. They were sophisticated psychological strategies refined over centuries of practice. The manuals describe specific techniques for identifying and exploiting individual vulnerabilities, methods for gradually escalating demands until complete submission became the only psychologically sustainable response, and elaborate reward systems designed to make victims complicit in their own exploitation. These training protocols were so effective that they were exported to temples throughout the region, creating standardized practices that ensured consistent results regardless of local cultural variations. The system had evolved into a precise science of human destruction, capable of transforming virtually any child into a compliant instrument of temple profit within months of beginning the process. These temples that once dominated the ancient skyline have long since crumbled to dust, but their shadows still fall across our modern world. The same willingness to sacrifice the innocent for institutional power, the same elaborate justifications that transform cruelty into virtue, the same systematic destruction of human dignity. These patterns echo through history with terrifying consistency. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how completely these horrors were normalized, celebrated even, by civilizations that saw themselves as enlightened. The children whose voices were silenced in those marble chambers remind us that progress is never guaranteed, that civilization is always one generation away from barbarism, and that the price of human dignity is eternal vigilance against those who would trade innocent lives for power, profit, or the hollow promises of gods who demand blood.